As you can see, I decided to break up the videos to make it a little bit easier to watch videos in smaller chunks as opposed to one long video that can be quite overwhelming. Okay, so the next learning theory we'll be focusing on is constructivism. And constructivism is based on the idea that people construct or make their own knowledge. So your reality is determined by your experience as a learner. The way you consider, learn, or take in new knowledge is influenced by your existing knowledge base. So, for example, if I could use religion in a very open way, if a student, for example, is taught about consequences or they're taught about something bad happening to a person, if they have a religious base that believes in, for example, punishment, they could then, when they learn something, they could consider it from the knowledge base of, you know what, that is a consequence for a sin, for example. So they would construct knowledge based on their previous knowledge, on their beliefs, on existing ideas and thoughts that that they come into the classroom space with. So they use their previous knowledge as foundation to build on it with the new things that they learn. And everyone's individual experiences makes their learning unique to them because everybody has unique experiences, different belief systems, different value systems, and the way you interpret all of that is very individualized. Two children can be in the same family and they have very different ways of perceiving a similar event. Therefore, learning is very, very unique to every individual. So it's defined as learning or the constructing of learning being a very subjective reality, very personalized, individualized. A key feature, like I said, the new knowledge is built on existing knowledge. And in terms of the learner, they would construct knowledge most effectively if there's peer-to-peer interaction and they actively participate in the construction of knowledge because they're talking to each other, they're looking at each other's viewpoints, considering their own viewpoints, reassessing their understanding, and then deciding on how they understand the concept. The main proponents here are Dewey, Piaget, and Piaget, if you'll remember, is quite prevalent or prominent in terms of cognitive development, and you'll do that a lot more in educational psychology. Then Montessori, and if that sounds familiar, yes, the Montessori schooling system is based on Maria Montessori's work, where learning is self-led and constructed at the child's own pace. Vygotsky was very prominent in the field of scaffolding and the zone of proximal development, and then Bruner as well. So the focus here, it's quite student-centered, it's the student's own pace, the learner is quite active in the learning process, and then scaffolding is very important. So scaffolding talks about the fact that you will build, if you think of a scaffold on a building, it is, there's steps up. You start at the bottom and then there's the next rung and then the following one and so on and so forth. And so scaffolding in terms of learning is first learning the basics before you're able to go on to a more difficult concept. So you build upon the learning. And the zone of proximal development in a nutshell basically talks about the teacher being available for the student to help them get to the next level. So the teacher helps them to move from A and supports them to get to B. It supports them to build on their learning, to extend their learning, if I can use that terminology. So essentially the zone of proximal development refers to what a learner can do without help and what the learner can then achieve with the help from a teacher and encouragement from a teacher or a skilled partner or mediator, whatever the case is. And so when we talk about proximal, we're talking about what are they close to mastering. So zone of proximal development then talks not only about the learner but also about the person that's supporting them in their learning. So again, just to make it clear, because I feel like I sound quite confusing, the zone of proximal development talks about what can the learner do on their own, then what are they close to mastering but with the support of an educator, of a mediator. So the mediator or educator has to be very aware of where that child is and what type of support the child needs, because they do not necessarily need you to hold their hand right through. There might just be a part that they're struggling with. So as the educator, it is crucial for you to understand where the child is, because everything that influences the child's behavior is unknown, influences the child's learning is unknown to you. They have their unique experiences, but it does help if you have some kind of understanding of the child and some kind of understanding of where they come from in terms of what they find easier and what is quite challenging for them. So as the educator, you foster a learning space that allows teamwork, that allows reflection, that allows students to work at their own pace, but also with inability. What will make you successful as an educator in this regard is that you really understand and you really get that that child, their learning is deeply impacted by their previous knowledge. That they really come to class with a knowledge base. They're not a clear slate as behaviorism talks about. They actually have their own thinking about something. They actually have their own way of viewing things. And so it's important to get that information and that communication going within your classroom spaces. A few more points about constructivism. It doesn't really fit on this page, but it's just things that are important to know about it, is that it's not, learning here is not viewed as a passive activity. You actually need to engage in learning, engage in activities for learning to take place. So students can do things. Considering we're doing assessment theory, we need to think about how would learners be taught and how would they be assessed. So things like discussions, activities, doing things like reading, identifying parts of information that you like, something that allows the student to engage and interact with the material is going to help you to firstly ascertain how they're acquiring the knowledge, but also how you would assess them later on. In terms of memory, prior knowledge is remixed to a current context, and very basically it means that prior knowledge will then be merged into the knowledge that is being constructed in the now. The knowledge transfer happens through socialization, so by interacting with the educator, the mediator, facilitator, the peers, whatever the case, even the literature and information, that is how knowledge takes place. And learners receive guidance in order for knowledge to be more accessible and internalized in a meaningful way. That's quite self-explanatory. And then how to do it. You guide the process of knowledge construction, and that's what you as educator do. You engage and encourage group learning activities. You pose good problems, so you give them a scenario and ask them to really get into it and talk you through it and talk through their understanding. And then dynamic learning opportunities are created because you can't really plan these things. Oftentimes they just happen and they're very beautiful in the moment. And so as long as you are creating situations where learners can interact and really stretch their minds, you are definitely providing the space for this type of learning to take place. Let's talk about the techniques. The techniques are around discovery, so exploration, discovering new ways of considering the same situation, considering the same problem, scaffolding as we spoke about earlier, I reach out to prior knowledge, and then of course social groups. The materials you'd use, how would you assess? You'd use things like peer feedback, because remember they are engaging with each other, discussing with each other, so peer feedback is quite important and quite a good tool to use. Peer reviews, or peer review assessments, and that's also something that's quite interesting. But remember, as the teacher, you need to guide this process. Peers can assess each other, but it's very tricky ground. It also depends on the age you are working with, and of course the rubric that you provide. I also like simulations, and that would be providing a scenario, creating role play opportunities. Students in intermediate phase love those. And then the learning, just to end it off, is based on personal experience and of course prior knowledge. We now move on to cognitivism. And cognitivism as a learning theory, it focuses on how information is received, organized, stored, and retrieved by the mind. It's really like thinking about the brain as a computer, how information is put in, or what the input is, how it is stored, and what folder or file do you later then go to acquire or to then use the stored information. The key features are internalization of content, like I said, how the input or the storing of information is done, how learning is working in the mind, and in this, another key feature is that students set their own goals and motivate themselves. The learner would be with this learning theory, the learner applies various learning strategies, so they would learn in a way that makes it makes learning most comfortable for them. So they would do things like classifying information. So this is also a learning technique and also study technique. So classifying or chunking information into manageable groupings and easy to remember groupings, linking different types of concepts, connecting things to real world examples. You can hear I do that a lot. I would create examples to illustrate my point. It doesn't necessarily mean this is the learning theory that I use the most. It's just one of the strategies that I use. Then also discussions and problem solving. So the proponents or the theorists here are Jerome Bruner and Albert Bandura. The focus is on teachers to create the space where students can do all of this, where they can employ their own techniques and strategies. And then, of course, the educator, it's important that the educator provides an open environment, and the environment needs to foster engagement or engaging the student in the various ways in which they can think and the various ways in which they can receive information and use that information as is necessary. A point that I want to make here about the educator is that the educator and the teaching needs to be very organized. It needs to be done in an organized manner for this learner to really grasp what is happening. It needs to be sequenced and organized, and it must be presented in a manner that is understandingful and meaningful to the learner, which is why I think that employing examples is quite important, because it actually needs to make sense to the learner. You cannot talk to a learner about something that is beyond the understanding. If you talk about a concept, for example, if a learner has never seen dumplings before, but you talk to them about dumplings, what it looks like, what they can imagine, but it isn't really meaningful to them because they don't know anything about it. But if you have you ever seen a child that has been made excited by a musical instrument, perhaps it's a teacher that talks to them about a musical instrument, they would so easily learn about a musical instrument because it is meaningful to them. They have a knowledge base from which to work from. So make sure that instruction and information and assessment is meaningful. It shouldn't just be a task done because it needs to be done. And then that will really help your learner to grasp the content in an effective manner. This learning theory, is very human-centered, person-centered. There's a strong focus on social and cultural context, so they matter. The inputs not have specific outputs, so you can generate original thoughts. So because a child gets information, it doesn't necessarily mean that that information is going to be used as a teacher would expect it would. They would take that information and interpret it in a way that makes sense to them and use it in context that makes sense to them. Remember that you need to keep the student engaged. You need to anticipate errors, and an error analysis or looking at where mistakes were made is very important and very useful, because learners will actually internalize information a lot more if they look at their mistakes and they consider where mistakes were made and they track their mistakes. It really is a very helpful process for them. When I think of cognitism, I think of kinesthetic learning, involved learning pattern. So when you do multiple intelligences, then it's very important for you to think back to cognitivism and the link that can be made here. So in terms of techniques, the techniques that are used are lectures, memorization. So lectures have to obviously also be meaningful. Memorization as well, using visual tools, because visual tools will be a good way for the learner to actually see it and then create a memory bank of whatever they've seen. Also, other strategies here that could be used, mnemonic devices. The mnemonic devices are, for example, if there's something they need to memorize, making a little rhyme out of it, or taking the first letter of every word and making a funny little sentence about it. And of course, like I said, yeah, visual aids are also quite important. And so for the materials, we'll look at things like multiple choice questions, essays, flashcards, things that can obviously visually stimulating, but also that they can really, in terms of essays or flashcards, there's some kind of activity or some kind of thinking process involved. Then the learning, it's about altering perceptions. And also importantly, I think cognitivism has a big stand in terms of developing higher order thinking. So if you think of Bloom's taxonomy, developing higher order thinking is quite an important task as students increase, or as the grades or the expectation level increase. So your goal here is to develop students' ability to understand elements, to retain information, and then later on to recall it, and then to interpret it in a way that meets the expectations or the goals of a lesson. We now move on to connectivism. It's really one that is relevant to us in the digital age, in the internet age. And so it considers learning within the digital age and how technology affects and how they contribute and maintain learning processes. Knowledge is seen as external, it's created and engaged online, and so connections made outside of your physical learning space. So things such as who you connect with online, the Google searches you do, the websites you visit, those are quite important. And then the social and cultural context matter. So socially, are you engaging with people online? Are the people that surround yourself also quite engaged online? In terms of culture, we talk about culture as in the arts. There are some children that are quite au fait with technology while others aren't. So is there a culture that is connected to this ability to work online? The learner here learns through making connections, as the name suggests, and the learner is a conscious individual in terms of they are actively involved in the learning process. The proponents are Siemens and Downs. And then the focus is on creating a network, creating connections in the digital space and in your physical space as well, creating social networks that extend beyond the physical relationships that you have. And then the educator is can make a big difference. So the educator can either keep the child behind because they are not as prepared to indulge and to get involved with the digital age as they should be, or so they could keep them behind, or they could use it to their advantage and have the child move into almost a flipped classroom space where they go and investigate information, where they move on to kind of bringing information into the classroom space, getting them excited, getting them to connect with different types of learning spaces. And so students can actually themselves lead their educational process. So I'm going to be doing this a little bit more. I'm going to refer you to the article that has been uploaded onto the unit. So that's the Duke, Harper and Johnson article about connectivism. And so I've explained a little bit about it. I would like you to now read the article as well to gain a deeper idea, deeper insight into connectivism. And we'll move on to the next learning. We now move on to andragogy. And this is a new term for me. I know pedagogy, but andragogy is new. And pedagogy, of course, we think about the educator and transferring the information to learners, usually children. Whereas with andragogy, this is adult learning, the focus on adult learning. So you're learning from adults, you're learning with adults. And it really refers to the methods and principles used in adult learning. Why I included it here? Because I find it quite important for you as adult learners or adults in the learning and tertiary space. It is relevant to you, but also within one of the courses in studying psychology, one of our courses was career development, career assessments. And part of this was that in today's, I don't just say today's day, but in today's person's life, in the lifetime of a person today, you can change your career up to 5 average apparently of 5 times in your lifetime. 5 times. And so when I first studied, for me, when you think about studying, this is what I'm going to be for the rest of my life. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a psychologist, whatever the case is. And that's what you're going to be. That's what you studied for. But more and more people nowadays are changing their careers, moving to different career paths, trying new things, which means that we're going to have a lot more adult learners in different spaces, even if they've studied something before. And so when we are educating children, we should encourage them to be lifelong learners. And part of this means that they would one day possibly be an adult learner. And it's therefore something I thought that would be quite useful to understand and to have some kind of knowledge base on. So the key features is on adult learning. And of course, if you think about adults, they'll be more driven, they'll be self-driven because it's something that they choose. The adults, they are studying for a purpose. Whereas if I think back to when I did my first degree, I was just studying because I knew I needed to be studying. Whereas now when I'm studying, I have a goal. I'm doing it because I want to do it. So it's something that you can actually relate to. The importance is placed on self-concept. What do you think about yourself within the learning space? How do you want to see yourself? What do you want to achieve? And then, of course, also readiness and motivation to learn. The learner is self-motivated, more serious about learning because they're an adult. And also, I added here they're juggling more because if I think about it myself, you're juggling a job, a family, children, social life, concerns about whatever's happening in the world at the moment. So definitely being an adult learner there's a lot more pressure, a lot more expectations, less sleep, definitely more stress. And yeah, it's quite an interesting phenomena if you think about adult learning. Here the proponent that I read about was Knowles, and I would suggest that you read up a little bit about Knowles, and then the focus is on self-directed learning. Really defining the learning process for yourself. It's quite an independent approach. And then there's also a lot of planning, sharing, and problem solving. I like the sharing part because as adult learners, you do need to connect and share with your learning cohort in order to be successful, because you cannot do it all on your own oftentimes there's so much happening that it's helpful to, for example, have someone developing one part of the study material, for example, and you sharing and planning together, and so on and so forth. In terms of adult education, the expectation, and I find the practice really, is that the facilitator rather than the educator, I think more the facilitator, you could call the lecturer the facilitator, is more respectful of the learner because they understand they come with prior knowledge, and that they are able to then use, for example, as a lecturer, I can use real world problems because I know that you understand the situation, for example, in the country, or the challenges with the curriculum or the education department, whatever the case is. So the lecturer is able to then really make learning prevalent and relevant to the time. Also, the lecturer hopefully should recognize that adults need to be able to make their own decisions, need to be independent in many ways, and then is respectful of that independence as well.